Hi guys, and welcome to this new episode of The Inexplicable. Let's be honest. In general, we believe we know our own mind. We use it every day to make decisions, remember, love, and dream. But what if I told you that right there in our psyche, the worst nightmares can hide? Some psychological conditions defy logic. Experiences so bizarre they seem like horror movies, but they're completely real. Syndromes that trap consciousness in dark labyrinths, that shatter the perception of reality, that distort one's very identity. Those who experience them can no longer trust their own mind. Every thought becomes suspicious. Every emotion is distorted. A true inner hell from which there is often no way out. In this episode, I'll guide you into the darkest corners of the human mind. I will tell you about 6 chilling psychological syndromes, rare, frightening conditions that reveal just how fragile the line between sanity and madness can be. So here are 6 chilling psychological syndromes that will keep you up at night. Third man syndrome. Imagine for a moment that you find yourself completely alone in the pitch black darkness of a cave with no exit, among the eternal ice of a deserted land, so vast and silent that time itself seems to have stopped, or in the emptiness of deep space where Earth is just a distant dot and the loneliness is infinite. When the mind wavers under despair, something inexplicable occurs. Someone appears next to you, or rather you begin to sense their presence. This is the third man syndrome, one of the most mysterious and distressing psychological experiences a human being can have. Past victims almost always share the same story. An unseen shadow, an intangible presence that emerges in the darkest, most desperate times. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but you know without a shadow of a doubt that it's there, right next to you. It watches you, it guides you, and sometimes, in the worst cases, I would dare say it haunts you. As I was saying, this experience always arises in extreme situations. When your strength runs out and your mind starts to give in, something inside you breaks. And that's when many people start to sense that presence. It's not just a simple random hallucination or a momentary trick of the mind. In fact, the stories of those who have experienced the third man syndrome are incredibly consistent. It's almost as if there's an invisible thread running through different cultures, eras, and circumstances. Let's take Sir Ernest Shackleton as an example, the heroic polar explorer during his legendary expedition in Antarctica. When it seemed that all hope was lost, Shackleton recounted that he felt the presence of a fourth invisible man walking with him during the desperate final march toward salvation. He and his companions were 3, but they clearly felt that there was someone else with them. A silent entity that urged them not to give up, to keep fighting against the impossible. Solo climbers on Everest, astronauts on risky missions, and air disaster survivors in unknown places have shared similar experiences. What is this third man? Experts believe that the answer lies in psychology. The third man would be a survival mechanism of the brain, an extreme last resort that the mind uses to cope with exhaustion and fear. When loneliness becomes unbearable, our mind creates an imaginary presence, a companion that protects us from panic and the feeling of total abandonment, that is, from despair. But not all accounts are reassuring. In some cases, this invisible presence turns into something sinister. It goes from being a support to being a persecutor. Several mountaineers have reported feeling that mysterious figure trying to push them toward the precipice. Whispering voices speak of death and the abyss. A particularly chilling story involves an astronaut stranded alone in space after a space station malfunction. For hours, an unknown voice would speak to him, whispering to cut the connections, to let himself go into the cosmic void, to abandon everything. It's like something dark hides behind this fragile mental illusion. A shadow that creeps into the deepest abysses of the human psyche and sometimes takes over, turning help into torment. In the end, no one really knows where suggestion ends and the real mystery begins. The third man is just a product of the human mind, a reflection of a brain pushed to the extreme, or perhaps something older, a true presence watching over us when we're most vulnerable. What's your verdict? Alice in Wonderland syndrome. How would you feel if you woke up one morning and discovered that the world around you was no longer the same? The room you're in stretches and shrinks like in a fever dream. The walls seem to bend, curve as if they had a life of their own, threatening, almost as if they wanted to wrap around you or crush you. The ceiling rises and vanishes into infinity above. Suddenly it crashes down, shrinking the space to a claustrophobic point. You look at yourself a little. Your hands suddenly appear huge, disproportionate, as if they belong to a giant or, even worse, to a stranger. But in an instant, they shrink to look like a child's. Small and fragile, unable to grasp reality. Even time, that dimension we blindly rely on, becomes unstable. Minutes stretch out or vanish so quickly that they leave you disoriented, stunned. It's hard to tell where reality ends and hallucination begins. If all this sounds like a story out of a dream, or rather a nightmare, you're not far from the truth. For those who suffer from the so-called Alice in Wonderland syndrome, it's not a fantasy. It reflects a frightening reality they must face daily. The name of this condition, of course, is inspired by the famous novel by Lewis, where the young Alice grows and shrinks on several occasions, exploring a world governed by impossible laws and distorted proportions. But what is imagination in the book is a tangible nightmare in the mind of those who live with this condition. Alice in Wonderland syndrome, also known as Alice in Wonderland syndrome, is a rare neurological disorder that profoundly alters visual, auditory, and temporal perception. Those affected experience true sensory disorientation lasting from minutes to hours, days, or even months, an experience that defies the logic and physical laws of our world. Its symptoms are multiple and, to say the least, frightening. For example, micropsia and macropsia. That is the impression that the objects around us are much smaller or exaggeratedly larger than normal. Another common symptom is distorted body perception, leading to conviction, that parts of our body grow excessively or shrink, that our hands, feet, or even our head transform into something unrecognizable, creating a disturbing dissociation. Many of the people who fell victim to the disorder also reported a clear alteration in their perception of time. Time can stretch until it feels infinite, or slip away so quickly that we lose the sense of every moment. Finally, several patients also reported experiencing a distortion of their surroundings. Rooms, corridors, and objects become deformed, bend, making the world around us unstable and terrifying. The exact causes of the syndrome remain unclear, but studies have linked it to specific situations. Among these are migraines, often accompanied by visual aura, viral infections such as those caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, and, in rarer cases, conditions like epilepsy or head trauma. It usually affects children more, who are more vulnerable to this neurological change, but adults can also be affected. Each episode, with its frightening distortion of reality, can turn into a psychological torment, generating anxiety, confusion, and a deep fear linked to the sense of total loss of control over one's senses. Because just think for a moment what it must mean not to be able to trust your own eyes, your own hands, your perception of the world, not knowing if that glass of water on the table is real or just a trick of the mind. Moreover, this additional curiosity adds an even deeper layer of mystery to this condition. It is said, in fact, that Lewis Carroll suffered from migraines with aura, a disorder that causes visual disturbances very similar to those described in his work. Perhaps it was from these personal experiences that the surreal and unsettling images were born, making his novel a timeless classic. In short, Alice in Wonderland syndrome reminds us that reality as we perceive it is not always reliable. We trust our mind to guard the truth, but it can betray us, plunging us into a distorted world where space, time, and even our own body escape the rules we think we know. Terrifying, don't you think? Folie à deux. Have you ever wondered if it's possible to spread a thought? Not just a simple common idea or a trivial opinion, but a truly delusional conviction, an obsession that slowly alters the perception of reality and plunges its victim into a dark abyss. It might sound like the plot of a movie, but shared madness or shared psychosis is real, a real clinical condition, but also one of the most mysterious and unsettling phenomena of the human psyche. Imagine a madness that spreads like an invisible virus, passing from one person to another, contaminating thoughts until it builds a parallel universe where truth and lies become indistinguishable. The typical scene is this: two individuals bound by a very close relationship. It could be a couple, two siblings, a parent and child, or inseparable friends, begin to share increasingly strange paranoid beliefs, often frighteningly bizarre. The initial spark almost always comes from a person already affected by psychotic disorders, called the inducer. The other, called the induced, starts out as a healthy person or someone with a vulnerable mind. But through constant exposure and deep emotional dependence on the first, he ends up absorbing that same madness. Together, these two individuals create a distorted reality where they begin to see plots of non-existent conspiracies, fear imaginary threats, or even hear voices that no one else can hear. Madness feeds on their relationship, becoming a dark and invincible pact. Now, for the most unsettling part, if the bond between these people is broken, for example, through separate hospitalization or physical distance, the indotto almost always manages to return to reality, as if the psychosis came from outside, not from within him. One of the most famous cases is that of the sisters Christine and Léa Papin. In France, in the 1930s, they worked as maids for a wealthy bourgeois family. But between them, a symbiotic, intense, and above all paranoid bond developed. This relationship deteriorated and ended in a brutal murder. They cold-bloodedly killed the landlady and her daughter, convinced that they were their enemies, ready to harm them. For many psychiatrists, this was definitive proof of the pathology's existence. Christine's original psychosis spread to Leah's fragile mind, dragging her with her into a vortex of madness and violence. But be careful. This phenomenon does not concern only extreme criminal episodes. Shared psychosis can appear more subtly and less visibly. Imagine a mother persuading her son that their neighbors are persecuting them, or two partners who fuel each other's paranoia about being watched by secret services. As time goes by, what was once a simple fear turns into an unshakable certainty, into an obsession that feeds on itself and grows. It's as if madness echoes between people, growing with each exchange until suspicion or fear becomes absolute truth. I believe this syndrome, though troubling, also reveals another truth. The human mind is fragile, permeable, and often alarmingly susceptible to contagion. A territory where the boundary between what is real and what is imagined can vanish into darkness. In question, a moment. The Paris Syndrome. The City of Lights, of eternal love, of timeless fashion, and of art that has shaped entire eras. For millions of people around the world, just saying its name evokes dreamlike images. Romantic walks at sunset along the banks of the Seine, historic cafes where you can savor a croissant, and breathtaking views that stretch to the horizon from the top of the Eiffel Tower. But behind this splendor, a dark side is hidden. A peculiarity that for some visitors manifests itself as a real waking nightmare. I'm referring to Paris syndrome, a rare and seemingly unbelievable disorder that mostly affects Japanese tourists in Paris. In extreme cases, it can cause severe psychological crises, with symptoms that go far beyond simple travel disappointment. But how can such a magical city trigger such an emotional breakdown? Well, the answer is simple but surprising. It all starts with a dream. For the Japanese, Paris is an almost mythical place. Movies, novels, advertisements, and television shows paint an idealized and mostly unreal image of it. A world made of pure romance, sophisticated elegance, and refined culture. For them, it's not just a tourist destination, but an ideal to achieve. When the trip finally becomes reality and these tourists set foot in the French capital, the dream begins to crumble. The real city is unlike what they imagined. Traffic is chaotic, the subway is crowded and noisy, shopkeepers can seem rude, and the area is filled with urban chaos that surprises and disorients. Pickpockets, the dirty streets, the incessant noise, the stress of city life build up relentlessly like an overwhelming wave. To a Western visitor, these elements may seem like minor, unimportant annoyances. Why has he maintained such an idealized, almost sacred image of the city for years? They become a devastating psychological shock. That gap between expectation and reality turns into a deep fracture in the mind. And this is where Paris syndrome kicks in. The symptoms emerge quickly and are dramatic. Intense panic attacks, dizziness and rapid heartbeat, delusions of persecution and extreme paranoia, even visual and auditory hallucinations. Some patients become convinced that Paris itself is a trap, a sort of malevolent illusion, or that someone is conspiring against them. In short, terror takes over. There have been several cases in the past of Japanese tourists in a panic, fleeing hotels in the middle of the night or seeking refuge at the Japanese embassy, begging to be sent home immediately. The situation became so widespread that the embassy was forced to set up a dedicated psychological support service for travelers in crisis. Although Paris syndrome isn't officially recognized in major psychiatric manuals, dozens of cases are documented each year. Experts agree in defining it as an extreme case of culture shock, amplified by a combination of social and linguistic factors. Japanese tourists raised in a society that values courtesy, precision, respect for rules, and order find themselves catapulted into an environment perceived as disorganized, abrupt, and often unpredictable. The brain, unable to process the gap between the ideal built over time and the harsh reality, goes into crisis, collapsing under the weight of a disillusionment too great to bear. But it's not just a matter of culture or travel stress. Some scholars have also hypothesized a connection with particular psychological traits and individual predispositions, along with the compounding effects of loneliness and isolation in an unfamiliar environment. Ultimately, Paris syndrome is a dark and fascinating warning. Sometimes the dreams we cherish the most can turn into our worst nightmare. When the human mind finds itself unable to bear the weight of disillusionment, it can sink into a true emotional abyss, where the City of Lights becomes the stage for an inner struggle, to say the least terrifying. Jumping Frenchman of Maine. What I'm about to talk about is, without a doubt, the most peculiar and in some ways inexplicable syndrome among those included in this episode. First of all, it's a disorder that only occurred once in history in a very specific geographical area. a remote corner of Maine where a small community of French Canadians lived. Men and women used to a hard life, marked by biting cold, working in the woods, and almost total isolation from the rest of the world. It was right here that medical anthropologists began to observe a phenomenon as curious as it was unsettling. That is to say, a large part of the members of that community showed an exaggerated and seemingly irrational reaction to simple stimuli. Just a sudden shout, a cough, or even a movement a bit more abrupt than usual was enough to make them literally jump like crazy springs. Jumping, shouting, moving uncontrollably, hitting the people next to them. And not only that, in those moments of extreme agitation, they would immediately obey any order given by anyone nearby, as if they were completely hypnotized, unable to resist. Some documented cases also involve echolalia, which is the repetition of vocalizations made by another person, and echopraxia, the repetition of movements performed by another person. While affected by the syndrome, the subjects were highly suggestible and couldn't help but repeat the words or sounds coming from the person commanding them, just as they couldn't help but hit, drop, throw, jump, and startle. This bizarre behavior was called jumping Frenchman of Maine, literally the man who jumps from Maine. And it was almost immediately classified as a new disorder of unknown origin. But what causes these overreactions? It was a neurological disorder, an evolutionary legacy that preserved an ancestral defense mechanism, a sort of exaggerated survival reflex. Or was it a cultural phenomenon linked to the extreme conditions of isolation, fear, and tension experienced daily by this community? There are many hypotheses, but a definitive conclusion is never reached. Leading studies indicate the disorder stems from an extreme form of the normal startle reflex, that automatic reaction we all experience when we're startled by a sudden noise, for example. In the case of the jumping Frenchman, however, this reflex became something uncontrollable, amplified to levels that defy logic. Some neurologists also hypothesized a genetic origin, perhaps an inherited trait accentuated by life in small, isolated groups, where the gene pool tends to remain limited. Another theory views the phenomenon as a learned or socially reinforced community behavior. Living in a hostile environment where fear and tension were constant, these exaggerated reflexes could be transformed into a collective ritual, an almost unconscious response, a prolonged environmental stress, a way to maintain social cohesion or to quickly submit to danger signals. This phenomenon has long interested distinguished scientists and scholars, from George Miller Bird, who first described it at the end of the 19th century, to modern neurologists and psychiatrists who are still trying to decipher its hidden mechanisms today. Be that as it may, the jumping Frenchman of Maine remains shrouded in an aura of mystery, an extraordinary example of how the human mind can respond in unpredictable and surprising ways when faced with extreme conditions. The smiling mass syndrome. And to conclude this overview of unsettling syndromes, I can't help but talk about the one that, in my opinion, deserves the award for the most disturbing, the smiling mask syndrome. Imagine being forced to smile constantly for days, weeks, months, years, even when inside you feel only sadness, anger, or fear. A smile that doesn't come from the heart, but becomes a forced expression, a fixed armor on your face. This is the basis of the smiling mask syndrome, a psychological and neurological disorder named after that unnatural and prolonged mask of a smile that ends up deforming not only the face of those who suffer from it, but also their perception of the world around them. The first study to describe this phenomenon comes from Japan, thanks to Professor Makoto Natsume from Osaka University, Shoin Natsume. He observed that many women, forced by the rigid Japanese work culture to maintain perfect smiles, sometimes for hours, during their duties in the service sector, began to not even realize they were smiling. That unnatural smile stayed on their faces, even when discussing painful or stressful experiences, making the expression a farce and an emotional prison. In Japan, especially for young girls who work with the public, smiling is not just a gesture of courtesy, it's a real golden rule without which your career can be compromised. The smile thus becomes a social obligation, imposed as an essential requirement to get and keep a job. This constant pressure ends up suppressing genuine emotions, causing depression, anxiety, and in many cases even physical disorders such as muscle pain or persistent headaches. The era when this demand to smile at all costs spread dates back to the 1980s right in Japan, with events such as Tokyo Disneyland's 1983 opening, which helped spread a social model where the perfect and forced smile became the norm in the workplace. But it's not just about Japan. In South Korea, the syndrome has also been recognized, where the smile mask is compared to a uniform, a necessary attribute to stand out in a competitive and impersonal work environment. A Korean psychological consultant even described this society as a circus of clowns where everyone wears big smiles, but they are empty, lacking real emotion. All of this helps us understand that the smiling mask syndrome is not simply a visual or psychological disorder. It is the testimony of a reality where outward appearance becomes a trap. A mask that is worn for too long ends up distorting identity, isolating the individual, and creating deep insecurity. Sufferers experience a constant sense of estrangement, not only seeing their own stage smile, but also noticing the same unsettling, unnatural stillness in others' smiles. And what could be more unsettling than the idea of not even being able to trust a smile? And so we come to the end of this episode of the podcast. But I want to conclude with a reflection. The truth is that we human beings rely completely on our minds to interpret the world around us, to find meaning, to navigate through life. But what happens when it's that very mind that betrays us? When reality and illusion blur, and what seems normal to us changes, becomes a source of terror. This invisible prison is inescapable. The real horror is not outside of us, hidden in the darkness or in some monstrous creature. It is inside us, hidden in the deepest recesses of our psyche. In that maze of deceptive perceptions lies the greatest and perhaps most unsettling mystery of all. What are your thoughts on these syndromes? Have you heard of them? Which do you find most terrifying and why? Let me know in a comment. The Inexplicable podcast is an original format, written and directed by Luca Parella, with sound design by Matteo Alessandro. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or share it with your friends.